Henry Caluahin enjoyed feeling the wind through his thick black hair as he drove his small American convertible down the two-lane highway leading to the southernmost part of his home island, Katani. Nestled in the southern Pacific Ocean, Katani comprised several islands, the largest of which spanned about 65 kilometers from end to end and was home to approximately 1.5 million natives and another 100,000 foreigners, mostly Americans. Katani was an independent nation with its own government, police, and defense forces. Historically, the nation had been ruled by a monarch but had adopted a democratic system similar to that of the United States. It had a president elected for a 5-year term and a House of Representatives whose members were elected every 2 years by the citizens. The nation had embarked on an aggressive modernization campaign more than 70 years ago under a previous monarch who felt it was time to bring the population into the 20th century. As a result, Katani now enjoyed all the comforts of modern life, including the internet, along with the trappings of a modern civilization. Fortunately, the people had managed to remain true to most of their ancestral values, and as a result, the nation still had the lowest divorce rate in the world, surpassing even India, which according to some reports had only a 1% divorce rate. Except for the strange rocks scattered on the slopes of Mount Sitani that glowed at night, the sandy beaches, and the hospitality of the population, Katani had almost nothing to offer potential conquerors and had so far escaped the stigma of foreign domination. Even the Japanese did not consider Katani during World War II, deeming it too far south to be of much use in their conquest of the Pacific. This was where Henry had been born and raised, the place he called home, and he loved it. It was a good day for driving, he thought. Not too hot, not too cold, and the humidity was bearable at this altitude. However, the reason for the trip both angered and saddened him. He looked at the woman sitting in the passenger seat. Her name was Chava. She was a California beauty, he thought. Blonde hair, soft, supple skin, firm breasts with prominent nipples that begged to be sucked, and tanned, toned legs made for sex. She wasn't just his woman, she was any man's dream. He had just over an hour before he reached his destination, so he thought about their life together. He met her 6 years ago when he first accepted a teaching position at the local campus of a U.S. university based in Washington, D.C. At the time, he had just finished his doctorate and had decided to return home. The local university management welcomed him with open arms and offered him the opportunity to lead the anthropology department. Chava had been among the first students to enroll in his class. She was bright, inquisitive, and beautiful, qualities that drew him to her almost immediately. Their relationship blossomed quickly, evolving from teacher-student to lovers within a few short months. They married a year later, much to the dismay of his traditional family, who had hoped he would marry someone from Katani. Henry's family had eventually come to accept Chava, charmed by her genuine efforts to embrace their culture and traditions. Chava, in turn, had fallen in love with the island, its people, and most of all, with Henry. They had built a life together that seemed perfect on the surface, but as with all things that appear too perfect, cracks had started to show. Chava had grown restless over the past year. She missed the hustle and bustle of California, the constant stimulation of city life. She had begun to feel suffocated by the tranquil, slow-paced lifestyle of Katani. Henry had tried to understand her feelings, but the cultural and emotional chasm between them had only widened. Their arguments had grown more frequent and intense, and the love they once shared seemed to be slipping away. Today's trip was supposed to be a turning point. They were heading to the southernmost part of the island, where Henry hoped a weekend getaway might rekindle the flame of their relationship. As they drove, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that this trip might be their last chance to save their marriage. He glanced at Chava, her eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses, her expression unreadable. He wondered if she was thinking the same thing. The convertible sped along the winding highway, the scenery a blur of lush greenery and distant ocean views. Henry gripped the steering wheel tighter, determination mingling with a sense of impending loss. He knew he had to make this work, for the sake of their love and for the life they had built together on this beautiful island. Position. He took to it like a fish to water, finding immense joy in teaching and engaging with the local youth. Chava worked in the admissions office as a counselor, and the two first met at a social event organized by the university's president. They hit it off immediately, dating for a year before deciding to get married. She was an only child and had tragically lost her parents in a car accident a few years earlier, leaving her without any close relatives. Chava's desire for a traditional Katani marriage struck Henry as peculiar. Most local girls preferred to avoid such traditional ceremonies, seeking a more modern approach. He initially thought she might be patronizing him or perhaps a bit delusional. He questioned her intentions, wondering if she truly understood the depth of what she was asking for. However, Chava remained adamant, insisting that she wanted a traditional Katani wedding. Reluctantly, he agreed, providing her with a text file containing the chant she needed to memorize and teaching her the correct pronunciation. Chava already knew enough of the local language to communicate at the markets, but the deeper cultural significance of her commitment was still somewhat elusive to her. The ceremony was beautiful and moving. Towards the end, Chava, dressed in a short white robe, knelt down and picked up the pillow beside her. She lifted it toward Henry and recited the traditional phrase flawlessly. The phrase roughly translated to, "I submit to you, my husband, in body, mind, and spirit." Although the phrase held a much deeper meaning, its full significance was known only to the oldest and most traditional members of the population. Henry took the sivage lying on the pillow, a short, curved dagger that symbolized a husband's readiness to protect and defend his wife to the death. Chava had intricately decorated the hilt with his family's seal and even anointed it with his own blood, honoring the old customs. After repeating the chant, Chava wielded the knife to cut the ties of her robe, letting it fall to the ground and revealing her naked body to the gathered witnesses. Henry opened his tunic and presented himself to her. Following tradition, Chava took him into her mouth, performing fellatio until he was fully erect. To Henry's amazement, she managed to take his entire length, which was slightly larger than the average Katani man. He then lifted her onto the altar, spreading her legs for all to see, and admired her shaved pubic area, a task husbands once performed with the sivage but was no longer necessary. In front of the gathered crowd, they consummated their marriage on the altar, reaching orgasm together. This act, in ancient times, served as proof of the bride's virginity and her worthiness for her new husband. Afterwards, Henry helped Chava down from the altar, and they walked down the aisle to his car, her legs still slick with his semen, a clear sign of her new status as his wife. After their first night on the island, they flew back to the United States for a week-long honeymoon in Las Vegas. The next 3 years were wonderful. Henry and Chava continued their work at the university, finding fulfillment in their respective roles. Their bond grew stronger, cementing their place in each other's lives as they navigated both the academic world and the rich cultural tapestry of Katani, and spent their free time making sweet love to each other. He couldn't imagine a better life. Then Chava was transferred to the main campus in Washington, D.C., so he also applied for a transfer, hoping that the university would give him the opportunity to teach in the U.S. Capitol. The board agreed to transfer him, and they both went to live and work in Washington. Chava had lived there before coming to Katani and promised to show him all the sights, not knowing that he had spent several weekends in the city while in college. Over the next year and a half, there were several changes in their lives. Chava's new position required her to sometimes work late, travel, and attend social functions, where she rubbed shoulders with the rich and famous. Sometimes she took him with her to these events. Although she introduced him as her husband and a respected teacher, he often felt like a token object or worse, an exhibit, a zoo creature that the locals stared at. More than once, he felt uncomfortable and irritated by the condescension with which others spoke to him. Some even raised their voices and spoke slowly, as if he were an invalid who did not understand English. More than once, he had to refrain from putting his fist through someone's face. He recalled a conversation he had with Chava after a recent event. "Are you okay, honey?" she asked as he stripped off his expensive suit. "No, I'm not," he growled in his deep baritone voice. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Did someone say something bad to you?" It's the way it was said, he told her. Remember that scene in The Outlaw Josie Wales where the character played by Chief Dan George was talking about meeting Abraham Lincoln at the White House? She nodded. Yes, I do, she said. They had just watched the movie on DVD a couple of nights before. I can relate to what he said, Henry continued. It's almost as if these people think that, because I'm from the Pacific Islands, I should have a bone in my nose and wear a loincloth. Well, you'd need a pretty long one, she told him, patting his crotch. He let out a chuckle. Don't they realize that I graduated at the top of my class at Harvard? He asked her. Don't they know how I worked to pay my way through college and not be a burden or have to carry a heavy debt? I don't think so, Chava said quietly. Well, I don't like these people you have to kowtow to, he said. And I sure as hell don't like being exhibited like some kind of zoo specimen. It's all part of the game, she said. But I understand how you feel. You don't have to attend these things if you're uncomfortable, you know. He shook his head. No, you're my wife, and I should be there to support you, he said. Besides, I don't like the idea of someone else accompanying you. By the way, what's up with that new boss of yours, Lucas Hamilton? She met Lucas for the first time that night and instantly disliked him. He had "pussy hound" written all over his face. She sighed. He's a piece of work, isn't he? Always trying to get too close for comfort. I've learned to keep him at arm's length, but it's exhausting. Henry clenched his fists, his protective instincts flaring up. If he ever tries anything with you, I'll make sure he regrets it, he said fiercely. Chava reached out, placing a calming hand on his arm. I can handle him, Henry, but thank you. It means a lot to know you have my back. Just focus on your work, and let's try to make the best of our time here. We'll get through this together. He took a deep breath, letting her words soothe him. You're right, we'll get through this. But I still don't trust that guy, he said, his voice softening but still firm. As they settled into their new life in Washington, Henry found solace in teaching. His students admired him for his knowledge and passion, and he took great pride in helping them grow. Chava, despite her challenging work environment, remained dedicated to her role, and together they navigated the complexities of their professional and personal lives. Their love for each other remained strong, a beacon of hope amidst the challenges they faced. And although the road ahead was uncertain, they knew that as long as they had each other, they could overcome anything. He was brought in recently, she said. He's from New York. He's really a sweet guy once you get to know him. He seems to have taken a liking to you, Henry remarked. He couldn't help but notice that Lucas had spent most of the night close to Chava. Sometimes, he thought, maybe too close. You're not jealous, are you? She asked with a teasing smile. He smiled and hugged her. Of course he does, she said playfully. But he knows you're married, right? Yes, he does, she replied, wrapping her arms around his neck. Good, Henry said. I hope he remembers. They ended the night making love, but he had a bad feeling. Something told him he had to keep an eye on Lucas Hamilton. Things went downhill over the next 6 months. Chava ended up being sent out of town with Lucas several times, and she started working much later in the evenings, more than ever before. As a result, their sex life virtually disappeared, as she always seemed to be too tired to do anything. It all fell apart one day when Henry was in his office reviewing student work. He was interrupted by a knock at the door. Come in, he said. The door opened, and a petite brunette poked her head in. She pushed her glasses up on her nose before speaking. Dr. Kaluahin, do you have a couple of minutes? She asked. He looked at her and instantly recognized her as one of the girls who worked in Chava's office, though he couldn't remember her name. He motioned for her to come in. Please come in, he said, and feel free to call me Henry. My students call me Dr. Kaluahin, but you're obviously not one of my students. She walked into his office and planted herself in front of his desk. What can I do for you, miss? Harper, she said quietly. April Harper, I work in your wife's office. Yes, of course, he said. What can I do for you, Miss Harper? Well, she began nervously. I don't quite know how to say this. I think it's best to speak your mind, he told her. She nodded her head. Well, it's about your wife and Mr. Hamilton, she said, gaining his full attention. I'm a little embarrassed to say it, since it's pretty personal, but I think what they're doing is wrong, and I thought you had a right to know. That is, unless you already know and approve of it. I know some people like that kind of thing." "What kind of thing is that, Miss Harper?" he asked. "What are they doing that bothers you so much?" "They're, well, having an affair," she said. He felt his face turn red. "Are you absolutely sure about that, Miss Harper?" he asked. "It's quite an accusation. Almost every day they go out to lunch," she said, "and their lunches usually last longer than usual. They take trips together all the time. He buys her flowers, and it's pretty obvious from the way they interact that it's more than just a professional relationship. Plus, all the girls talk. Mr. Hamilton has quite a reputation, although he tries to keep it all under wraps." Henry sat back in his chair, absorbing the information. His mind raced with thoughts and emotions. "Thank you for telling me, Miss Harper," he finally said, his voice tight with restrained anger. "I appreciate your honesty." April nodded, looking relieved. "I thought you deserved to know. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news." After she left, Henry sat in his office, staring at the wall. The sense of betrayal cut deep. He had suspected something was off, but hearing it confirmed was a blow. He knew he had to confront Chava, but the thought of it filled him with dread. He couldn't shake the image of her with Lucas, the man he had instinctively distrusted. That evening, when Chava came home late again, Henry was waiting for her. "We need to talk," he said, his voice calm but firm. Chava looked at him, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "What is it, Henry?" He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I know about you and Lucas," he said, watching her reaction closely. Her face went pale, and she took a step back. "Henry, don't," he interrupted. "Just tell me the truth." She looked down, unable to meet his eyes. "Yes, it's true," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The admission felt like a punch to the gut. Henry closed his eyes, trying to control the anger and hurt bubbling inside him. "Why, Chava?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why would you do this to us?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "I don't know, Henry. It just happened. I never meant to hurt you." "But you did," he said, his voice cold. "You betrayed me, Chava. You betrayed our marriage." She broke down, sobbing. "I'm so sorry, Henry. I don't know what to say." He stood up, looking down at her. "I need some time to think," he said. "I don't know if I can forgive this." As he walked out of the room, leaving her crying, he felt a mix of sadness and resolve. Their future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: things would never be the same again. "I see," said Henry. "Have you personally witnessed anything to suggest they're having an affair? Have you seen them kissing or doing anything inappropriate? PDAs? Anything?" April Harper fidgeted nervously. "I saw them kissing one day as they were leaving his office," she admitted. Henry nodded when she finished. "Tell me, Miss Harper, how often does Mr. Hamilton make you all work off the clock?" he asked. She shook her head. "We generally don't work off the clock," she said. "The university is very strict about it. Chava and Lucas sometimes stay late, but the others usually don't. The only time we work off the clock is when we're preparing for graduation or enrolling students. But even then, we have time off to make up for it. They hate paying overtime." "I see. Have you said anything to anyone else?" he asked. "No, I haven't said anything to anyone," she replied. "I wanted to tell you first. We all like Chava and don't want her to get in trouble. Still, it's disturbing. If the dean or the president saw it, there would be hell to pay." "Yes, there would be," said Henry. "Thank you for bringing it to my attention, Miss Harper. I'll take care of it from here." "Thank you, Dr. Caluagine," she said as she left the office. As soon as she was gone, Henry pulled up a Word document he had saved on his computer. It was a list of private investigators and divorce attorneys he had been collating for a while. He hoped he wouldn't have to use that information, but he felt as if he had no choice. If she cheated on him, as April claimed, he would have no choice but to divorce her. He picked up the phone and made a call. He wasn't surprised when Chava texted him later that day to tell him she would be working late. He sat at the dining room table and pecked at the food, wondering what his wife and Lucas were doing at that moment. Finally, he tossed the leftover lasagna into the garbage disposal and went upstairs to the master bedroom. He changed into pajamas and lay down on the bed with the TV on. He woke up when he heard Chava in the room. She walked over to him and kissed him on the forehead. Her hair smelled of freshly washed shampoo, and he thought he detected a whiff of aftershave. "I'm so sorry," she said. I didn't know it would keep me this long. I ate something on the way home. She went into the bathroom and came out shortly after in flannel pajamas. That was his cue that there would be no sex tonight. He didn't want to sleep with her anyway, not if she'd just been with Lucas. You've been working late a lot lately, Henry said. How much longer is he going to keep this up? It's hard to say, she said. He's had the whole department working late. He felt anger at hearing her lie to him, but he restrained himself. The whole department, huh? He asked. I thought the university frowned on overtime. Normally, yes, she said, but he's going to have a big meeting soon with some major donors, and we have to be prepared. That reminds me of something, Henry said, trying to keep his voice steady. We're leaving for that conference in Chicago next month. You still planning to come with me? Shava looked at him, surprised. Of course, she said. Why wouldn't I? Henry nodded. Just checking, he said. I know things have been hectic lately. Shava sighed and sat down on the bed beside him. I know it's been tough, Henry, she said, but this will all be over soon. Just hang in there a little longer. He forced a smile. Sure, he said, I'll hang in there. As she leaned over to kiss him goodnight, Henry couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal that gnawed at his insides. He lay awake long after she had fallen asleep, his mind racing with thoughts of what he had to do next. He needed to get to the bottom of this, and he needed to do it fast for New York on Friday. We'll leave before lunch and spend the weekend away. That's very little time, Henry replied. It was already early Thursday morning. He didn't buy her excuse, but decided to play along for now. That's why we're working so hard right now, Chava said, her voice attempting to sound sincere. I'm sorry. I'll make it up to you. Okay, he said, rolling onto his side. He knew this was bullshit, but he wanted to give her enough rope to hang herself. Later that day, Lucas paid an uninvited visit to Henry's office. He knocked on the door and entered before Henry could respond. Henry looked up and saw Lucas's perpetual, insincere smile. What can I do for you, Mr. Hamilton? Henry asked, his voice cool and controlled. I just wanted to stop by and apologize for monopolizing your wife's time, Lucas said, his tone oily. I'm sure you must have heard the rumors, and I just wanted to assure you that nothing inappropriate is going on. I'm not a big believer in rumors, Mr. Hamilton, Henry replied. I deal in facts and evidence, and I certainly hope for your sake that nothing inappropriate is going on. Lucas's smile wavered for a moment. This wasn't the reaction he had expected. He had always thought of academics as weak, but something about Henry made him uneasy. Maybe it was the calm, inscrutable way Henry looked at him, or the firmness in his voice. Nothing about Henry suggested weakness. For a fleeting moment, Lucas considered abandoning his pursuit of Shava. Of course not, Dr. Kaluahine, Lucas said, regaining his composure. By the way, has Chava told you that we'll be in New York this weekend? She did, Henry said, his tone flat. He deliberately avoided giving Lucas permission to refer to him by name, as he had an intense dislike for the man. I have to say she gave me very short notice. I had planned to go out with her Friday night. She's been spending more time with you than with me lately. Again, I apologize for that, Lucas said. It's our job. It never ends, you know. When do you think I'll be able to spend some time with my wife? Henry asked with a hint of sarcasm. Pretty soon, Lucas said. We just need to take care of a few things. Look, I've got to go now. It's been nice talking to you. Henry said nothing as he watched Lucas leave the office. As soon as Lucas was gone, Henry picked up the phone and made another call. That afternoon, he received a message from Shava saying she had to work late again to prepare for the weekend meeting. He wasn't surprised, and the email he received on his personal account confirmed his suspicions. He left for home, stopping for dinner along the way. He had had enough of lies and leftovers. Around 8 o'clock that evening, he called Chava at her office number, but the call went to voicemail. He left a message and then called Lucas's office number. He got the same voicemail, but left no message. Henry read and reread the message he had received earlier that day, looking at the attached photos. He was still at the computer when Chava returned home that evening. Are you still awake? She asked, looking worried. Have you eaten anything? I stopped for dinner on the way home, he said, not looking up from the screen. I'm tired of leftovers. I'm sorry, she said. We were just going over everything one last time for the meeting. So you were in your office? He asked. his voice steady. Well, yes, she replied, hesitating slightly. Where else would I be? Henry's eyes narrowed as he finally looked at her. I don't know, Chava. You tell me. She blinked, taken aback by the coldness in his tone. What do you mean by that? He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached for the printed photos and handed them to her. Explain these, he said quietly. Chava's face turned pale as she looked at the photos. Henry, I can explain, she began, but he cut her off. Save it, he said, his voice icy. I'm done with lies. We're done, Chava. I'll be filing for divorce first thing tomorrow. Chava stood there, speechless and devastated, as Henry walked past her and out of the room. The reality of her actions had finally caught up with her, and there was no escaping the consequences. You tell me, he said. I called your office at 8 o'clock but got no answer. I also called Lucas's office. We were in the conference room, and we didn't hear the phone ring, she replied. He knew the layout of her office and knew that was a lie. Even if that were the case, she should have seen the message light, indicating someone had called. Didn't you see that I had left a message? He asked. I didn't even look, Henry. I'm sorry, she said. By the way, Lucas said you were a little rude to him earlier today. And what's this about a date on Friday night? You never mentioned anything about that to me. It was supposed to be a surprise, he said. I guess it doesn't matter anymore. Of course it matters, Henry, she insisted. No, it's not like that, he replied. I have to go to bed now, Chava. Good night. He climbed the stairs to the master bedroom, wondering how much longer the deception would last before he put an end to it. He said nothing as she slipped under the covers and tried to curl up next to him. I love you, Henry, she whispered in his ear. He growled in response. I love you too, he said quietly, a hint of sadness in his voice. Good night. She took the hint and turned away from him. He could hear her sobs from the side of the bed, but he pushed them from his mind. The next morning, he cornered her before leaving. Can you at least tell me where you are staying and keep in touch with me over the weekend? He asked. Of course. She wrote down the name of the hotel and the room number and handed it to him. Thank you, he said, folding the paper and putting it in his pocket. Have a good trip. He turned to walk out the door, but Chava intercepted him. Henry, what's wrong with you? She asked. You haven't been yourself lately. Have I done something to make you angry with me? He almost laughed out loud. I think you know the answer, he told her. Her face paled as he walked out the door without kissing her goodbye. I love you, Henry, she said as he climbed into his car. So you said, he replied, before starting the car and heading to work. Although the damage had already been done, he hoped she would realize her mistake and change her mind about going to New York. He already knew from the investigator's report that the meeting was a sham concocted by Lucas to get the two of them alone for a weekend. But unfortunately, she and Lucas left for the airport at lunchtime, and he didn't hear from her until later when she arrived at the hotel. He didn't hear from her for the rest of the weekend, but he did hear from the investigator, who kept him up to date on what the two lovers were up to. According to reports he read, they had a great time, visited local nightclubs, danced and drank, and then had sex for most of the weekend. He almost put his fist through a wall when he saw a video of the two of them in bed. He couldn't help but notice that Lucas wasn't using any kind of protection. He didn't know if Chava was still on birth control. He considered his options. In his mind, divorce was a no-brainer, but he also knew, from conversations with colleagues, that it could get messy. There was so much at stake: his career, their social standing, and the pain it would bring both of them. Still, he couldn't see any other way out. The betrayal was too deep, and the trust was shattered beyond repair. That in the United States, divorce almost always went badly for husbands. Then an idea occurred to him, and that Sunday, he made a couple of calls overseas. He was already in bed when Chava came home Sunday night. Normally, he greeted her with a hug, a kiss, and a roll in bed. But not this time. He didn't even offer to help her carry her bags upstairs. She put the suitcases away in the closet, changed in the bathroom, and got into bed. She tried to kiss him, but he turned away to avoid touching her. The next morning, he got up before her and left the house without saying a word to her. During his break, he contacted his investigator and obtained the full report of Chava's activities over the weekend, then made another call. Chava tried to contact him throughout the day, but he ignored her calls and messages. That night he saw her at home, but spoke to her very little. Finally, she cornered him in the living room after dinner. "Henry, what is it?" she asked. "You haven't said 2 words to me since I got home. Don't you want to know if we've been successful?" He stared at her before speaking. "I'm sure you got what you wanted," he said. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked. He picked up the laptop and showed a video of her in bed with Lucas. Her eyes widened as he played the video. "My God, Lucas, how good you feel inside me," moans the Chava in the video as Lucas pumps his seed inside her. "Better than that savage you married?" Lucas asked. "Please, you know I don't like you talking about him like that," she said. "He may be a savage, but he's a good man." "Well, why are you here with me instead of him?" he asked her. "You know why, Lucas," she said. "I do," he said, wrapping his arms around her. "Come on, let's do it again." Disgusted, Henry turned off the video and glared at Chava. "How did you get it?" he asked Henry when he stopped the video. "What difference does it make?" he replied. "What I'd like to know is why." "Henry, it was just sex, that's all," she said. "It had nothing to do with you. You know I would never hurt you." "Well, you did," he said. "So tell me, dear wife, I noticed you didn't bother to use protection. Were you planning on getting pregnant by him and trying to pass it off as mine?" "I had never thought about it," she said. "Weren't you worried about diseases you might catch from him?" asked Henry. "According to my report, Lucas has at least 2 other women he sees regularly, and that's not counting his frequent one-night stands." "He assured me he's clean," Chava said. "And of course, you foolishly believed him," Henry said. "After the way you disrespected me, I can't continue to work here. I've asked for a transfer home. I've already spoken to the chancellor, and he agrees it's for the best. He also agrees to fire you and Lucas for flagrantly violating university rules." "When do you plan to leave?" she asked. "At the end of the quarter, which ends this week," he said. "We leave on Friday." "What about us?" she asked. "There is no us anymore," he told her. "You killed that. The divorce will be over when we get back. You and Lucas will have to be there. What you do after that, I don't care." "Why does Lucas have to be there?" she asked. "Why do you think?" he asked in reply. "It's him you were cheating on me with. The order has already been given. He can leave peacefully, on his own, or he can be extradited." "Extradited?" she asked. "Isn't that a little extreme? You forget that the Katani nation has an extradition treaty with the U.S., he said. "When you married me, you got dual citizenship. As for Lucas, he has no choice. He'll be there, one way or another." Henry stood up, indicating that he was finished and would say no more. Chava sat there, stunned at what had just happened. Lucas had assured her that Henry would never find out, but he had. "Please, Henry, I don't want a divorce," she said tearfully. He looked at her for a few seconds before leaving the room. "Why did you do it?" he asked. "Wasn't I good enough for you?" "You're the best," she said. "Then explain to me why," he demanded. "Well, Lucas and I met in college," she said. "He was my first, and I guess I fell in love with him all over again." "I guess the old saying is right," he told her. "What saying is that?" she asked in confusion. "It's a version of the biblical passage that says there is a time for everything," he said. "A time to cheat and a time to die." "What do you mean?" she asked. "Are you saying there's no hope for us?" "When you cheated on me, you killed our marriage," he said. "You killed us. I hope it was worth it." The rest of the week was difficult. The provost called Lucas and Chava into his office and dismissed them both for violating university rules on fraternization. He then handed Lucas a sheet of paper that had been emailed to him the day before. "What the hell is this?" asked Lucas angrily. "A summons from the Kingdom of Katani," the chancellor said. "You are part of Dr. Kaluahine's divorce. I have been told that if you refuse to go, you will face extradition. A plane ticket is being sent by express mail. Security will meet you there." "This is bullshit," Lucas exclaimed. "Maybe," the chancellor said. "But the State Department has told me that everything is legal. They're staying out of it. Now pack up your trash and get out of my school, both of you." Dejected and embarrassed, Chava went to her desk and gathered her things. Lucas, however, had another idea and headed for Henry's office. Chanted the ancient phrases that had been drilled into her. She could feel her heart pounding, fear and uncertainty clouding her thoughts. What had she gotten herself into? When she emerged, The king himself stood ready to preside over the ceremony. Henry was already standing by the ancient rock plank, his expression solemn and unreadable. Chava's heart sank further. She walked slowly towards him, every step feeling like an eternity. The king raised his hands, calling for silence among the assembled elders and guards. "Today, we gather to witness the dissolution of a marriage," he began in a deep, resonant voice. "In the traditions of our people, this sacred place bears witness to both the beginning and the end of unions." Chava trembled as the king continued. She barely heard his words over the pounding of her own heart. She glanced at Henry, searching his face for any sign of the man she had once loved so dearly. But his expression remained stone cold, his eyes fixed on the king. "Henry Kaluahine," the king said, turning towards him. "You stand here to dissolve your marriage to Chava Kaluahine. Is this your wish?" "Yes," Henry replied, his voice steady and firm. The king nodded and turned to Chava. "Chava Kaluahine, do you understand the gravity of this ceremony?" "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Then speak your truth," the king commanded. Chava swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. "I betrayed my husband. I broke our sacred vows. I understand why we are here." The king nodded solemnly. "In our traditions, betrayal is a grave sin, but there is also room for forgiveness and redemption. Henry, have you any final words for your wife?" Henry looked at Chava, his gaze piercing. "You shattered my trust, Chava. You disrespected our bond in the worst way imaginable. But I will not let hatred consume me. I release you from our vows, and I release myself from the pain you caused." Chava's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I truly am." The king raised his hands again, signaling the guards. "Prepare the final rite," he said. Chava watched in terror as the guards approached Henry with a ceremonial blade. She knew this was part of the ancient tradition, a symbolic act to sever the ties that bound them. Henry took the blade, his movements deliberate and controlled. He stepped forward and made a small cut on his palm, letting the blood drip onto the rock plank. Then he handed the blade to Chava. Her hands shook as she took the blade. She mirrored Henry's actions, cutting her palm and letting her blood mix with his on the rock. The king then stepped forward, placing his hands over theirs. "With this blood, the bond is broken," he intoned. "You are no longer bound as husband and wife." Chava felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. The ritual was almost over, but the weight of her actions would haunt her forever. The king stepped back, and the guards led Chava away from the rock plank. She was given her clothes and allowed to change back into them. When she emerged, Henry was waiting for her, his expression softer now. "Chava," he said quietly, "go back to the United States. Start anew. Find your path without me." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I will, Henry. I promise I'll do better." Henry gave her a small, sad smile. "Goodbye, Chava." "Goodbye, Henry," she whispered. She walked down the steps of Mount Satani, feeling the weight of her past lift off her shoulders with each step. Henry watched her go, his heart heavy but resolute. He knew he had made the right decision, and now it was time to move forward. Back in the village, life continued. Henry returned to his duties, finding solace in his work and the support of his community. He knew healing would take time, but he also knew he was strong enough to overcome this betrayal. As he stood on the edge of the ancient rock plank, looking out over the island he loved, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The traditions of Katani had guided him through the darkest time of his life, and now they would guide him towards a brighter future. Henry remembered that day on the beach when Chava had given him the traditional knife. He hoped he would never have to use it. He put it on his belt and went back outside. By this time, Chava was ready and being led to the plank, dressed in a short red robe. Lucas had already been handed over and was standing on the plank, arms and legs firmly secured. He wasn't very happy, but the guards had already informed him to keep quiet unless he was being addressed. Henry took a step before the pavilion and bowed to his uncle, who acknowledged him with a nod. He then took his place in front of the court, which was seated in a semicircle before the board. "Prince Henry Kaluahine," said the man in the center of the semicircle. "This court has reviewed your petition for divorce. We have also reviewed all the evidence and have determined that your case is valid. Based on the evidence, your petition for divorce has been granted. Do you wish to address those who have wronged you before executing final judgment?" "Yes, counselor," Henry said. "Very well then," the older man said. "Proceed." Henry bowed to the court and turned to Chava and Lucas, who were now tied together on the board. He could tell that Chava was frightened, as she had every right to be. Lucas, for his part, had no idea what was about to happen and was still as arrogant as ever. "What the hell is this all about?" asked Lucas as Henry walked toward them. "Shut up," Chava hissed at Lucas. "Why?" Lucas asked. "Are they going to sacrifice us to their volcano god or something?" "God, you're an idiot," she whispered. "Are you finished?" asked Henry. They said nothing as they looked back at him. Henry continued to stare at his soon-to-be ex-wife. "Do you remember the promise you made me on the beach 5 years ago?" he asked. "I remember," she said. "Did you understand the nature of the oath we swore to each other?" he asked. "I did," she said slowly. Henry nodded his head, sad. He had given her an out, but she had not accepted it. It would have been one thing if she didn't understand the nature of their marriage commitment. However, her admission to the contrary sealed their fate. "Promise?" Lucas asked. "What promise?" Chava wanted a traditional Katani marriage, part of which requires the couple to pledge their mind, body, and soul to each other for as long as they live, Henry explained. "You see, Lucas, here we believe that the most important traits a person can have are loyalty and fidelity. Without them, nothing else matters. In the old days, when a Katani couple married, they would promise those things to each other, in front of witnesses, with full knowledge that the cost of betrayal would be their own lives." He pulled the sharp, curved knife from his belt. Lucas's eyes widened at the sight of the blade. "But that's murder," Lucas stammered. "In your culture, maybe," Henry said. "Here, we call it divorce. This knife was given to me by Chava on the day we were married, as tradition dictates. It's more than just an ornament or a trinket to hide behind glass. In my ancestors' time, it was worn by the husband as a sign that he was unavailable. It also served as a warning to anyone who might intrude on the couple. Someone like you, Lucas." Henry moved swiftly. A red line appeared on Lucas's neck, and his eyes widened as he realized that his carotid artery had just been severed. Blood gushed and spilled down his neck, and he began to stagger as he lost strength. Chava tried to steady them on the rock plank, but found it difficult as Lucas lost the strength to stand. Suddenly, a strong gust of wind came crashing down on them, sending Chava and Lucas tumbling into the abyss. Henry closed his eyes for a moment to keep from sobbing. He opened his eyes and threw the blade into the large hole, then took off his wedding ring and threw it behind the knife. He heard a hammer behind him, and the head of the court took the floor. "This divorce is final," he said. Henry stared straight ahead as the court gathered their things and left. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see his uncle standing beside him. "You loved her," his uncle said. "I did," Henry said. "You even gave her a way out, but she wouldn't take it," the older man said. "In the end, she did the honorable thing." "I guess so," Henry said. "I know this has been the hardest thing you've ever had to do, my son," the king said. "Believe me, when you get to my position, it doesn't get any easier." "You'll outlive me, uncle," Henry said. The old man let out a chuckle. "Hardly," he said. "In any case, your honor has been restored. Now is the time to mourn what has been lost and move on. By the way, Seika is anxiously awaiting your call. She still loves you and has managed to keep the hounds at bay." "After all these years?" asked Henry. "Yes," said the king. He pulled out a letter and handed it to Henry. "She would make a good wife for you and a good queen when the time comes. And I must admit, I've always liked having a real doctor in the family." The last time Henry had spoken to her, she was in the United States studying medicine and doing her residency. "Now please call the girl and give her your number and let her know I'm not your answering service," the king said with a smile. Henry burst out laughing. "Thanks, uncle," he said. "I will." The old man smiled and patted him on the shoulder before walking away. Henry went to his tent and took off the tunic he was wearing. He sat for a moment and thought about Chava. He wiped away his tears and walked downstairs to his car. When he got into the car, he pulled out his phone and saw that he had reception. He dialed the number his uncle had given him. "Cha," said a sweet female voice on the first ring, thinking back to his younger years and remembering the sweet, curvaceous brunette woman he was so attracted to before he met Chava. "Cha," he said in response. "The divorce is final." "Good," she said. "Now please come home to the one who loved you first, Henry. I have missed you so much." "I'm on my way," he said. Maybe there was something special about first love, he thought.